Sorry, I forgot about that. All right, there we are. We're live on the stream. So by what I've said so far, it comes down to you. It comes down to you and your own sensibilities, and you're being able to move through the morass of misinformation that confronts you on a regular basis. And as I've quoted many times, Mark Twain, if you listen to the morning news, you're misinformed. And if you listen to the evening news, you haven't got a chance at the truth. But, he didn't say it that way, but words to that effect. And so what I look for now are kind of major events that are taking place around this planet that have a direct impact on what is going to happen in my country, the United States, in the next month or two. And something I noticed that just happened between Russia and the UK is the fact that the London Sunday Times yesterday reported that Russia has withdrawn its ambassador to the United Kingdom, Andrei Kelin, and that the Kremlin has not submitted to the foreign ministry of the United Kingdom any candidates to replace him. And Kelin, known for pointed attacks on Britain's imperial and subversive activities, left on July 21 after having served for 7 years as Russia's ambassador to the UK. And a spokesman for the Russian embassy, according to the London Sunday Times yesterday, said Kelin had made considerable efforts to preserve contacts and channels of communication with the UK and accused the United Kingdom government of choosing a path of confrontation with Russia. And then the spokesman from the Russian embassy, talking about Ambassador Kelin, he said he left Britain in the hope that a more constructive and respectful dialogue could eventually be restored should the UK reconsider its policies towards Russia. Now, what does that mean? What does it usually mean when a government withdraws its ambassador from another government? You see, the Russian embassy in London stated that the Kremlin did not intend to downgrade the level of diplomatic relations between the two countries. And I'm quoting here from a release by the Russian embassy. As for the state of Russia-UK relations across all areas, they have deteriorated to an unprecedentedly low level entirely on London's initiative. Now, think about that for a moment. Now, the Sunday Times wrote that, quote, embassy staff are understood to have no indication of when a successor might be appointed. The relationship between the UK and Russia deteriorated further last week after it emerged that British drones had been used by Ukraine to attack targets on the Russian mainland, prompting the embassy in London to threaten unspecified consequences. Now think about that some more here. The reason why the British made drones, what the British are doing is they're taking drones that come from another country and refitting the rocket motors so that these things can fly at lower altitudes at higher speeds, making them more difficult to shoot down. Now, think how the Russians look at that. How would the Russians look at this? The Russians know that England, if not in the sense of war, and of course, England was in the Allies, and the Allies fought in conjunction with Russia against Germany. And I was reading some stuff from Patton recently, General George Patton, where he said we fought the wrong enemy. We should have been fighting Russia in World War II. But England has been at war with Russia for a long, 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 long time. And I still kind of fall back on one of the less published, less well-known prophecies of Joseph Smith, where he said, when you see the Russian bear put its paw upon the British lion, you will know that the winding up scene is not that far away. I don't know anybody else who quotes that. I've never heard anybody else quote that except me. Now, he said that in the last year of his life. And so now, finally, the Sunday Times cited a UK national security source on what the deliberate signal from Moscow might be when the Russian embassy said that what London is doing is threatening unspecified consequences by rearming these drones. Now, how else could Russia look at the United Kingdom if the United Kingdom is upgrading Ukrainian drones to be fast? They're essentially turning them into cruise missiles. How is Russia supposed to look at that? Oh, well, if you're going to do that, then we're going to do this. No. This is coming down to the finish line. So finally, the Sunday Times cited a UK national security source without a name on what the deliberate signal from Moscow might be when they said unspecified consequences. And this is quoting from the Sunday Times yesterday. They are basically saying you guys don't matter, and that frankly London and the UK don't count for anything anymore. Now, how are we supposed to take that? Now, the effect of Ukraine's drone campaign against the Russian refineries, and this is where these drones are going, into the Russian refineries. How is Russia supposed to look at this? Because the Ukrainian strikes on Russia's export capacity for oil products. This is an interview that was published on the Zero Hedge with an oil expert from Jefferies Investment Bank. Quote, refinery outages. The duration of downtime depends on the complexity of the unit hit and the availability of replacement materials with no average downtime per strike. That said, about 50% of outages are less than 2 weeks, 75% less than a month, but they have been a handful of 3 to 6 month outages. And what does this mean? The quote continues, the oil expert highlights that Soviet refinery units were designed to be dispersed to defend against strikes, and that Russia has developed domestic engineering capabilities. Still, sanctions and technology restrictions play a role to compensate for the damaged refineries. Functional refineries are running at higher expectations. Now, you remember, one of the best things that's happened for Russia since this stuff started was the demand, especially with the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz, is the demand for Russian oil. Well, in April of this year, in response to these attacks, Russia banned gasoline exports and they banned diesel exports, which is contributing to the problems that we have out there. But how, again, I ask you, how is Russia supposed to look at this? How do they look at the United Kingdom? If the United Kingdom is upgrading drones to where they turn into essentially cruise missiles that can go deep into Russian territory, aimed at Russian petroleum refineries. How long will Russia put up with that? Now, on this side, President Trump quickly and kind of matter-of-factly posed that the military might of the United States was the bottom line solution to our financial problems. Yes, we have problems here with energy, and we have problems with food crisis prices and shortages, and we have problems with a growing shortage of petroleum, as some experts have said, as early as Thanksgiving. Crude could be 150 a barrel. And the president is saying our military solution, our military strength is a solution to our problems. Now, according to CNN, Trump was first asked on Friday about last week's failed intervention by U.S. Secretary of Treasury Scotty Bessent, into the bond market, where he spent all this money trying to buy back U.S. bonds to reduce the interest level. Because some experts that I followed, like Douglas McGregor, was saying that if the bond interest gets above 5%, especially on 30-year bonds, let alone 10-year bonds, there's no way in the world the U.S. could possibly afford to pay that interest, and that would be the end of trust in the bond market. Well, it's over 5%. So in order to try to bring that interest rate back down, Bessent did a huge buyback of U.S. bonds. So the reporter asking President Trump asked, did you direct Secretary Bessent to interview in the bond market? Was that your idea? And Trump said, no, not at all. He's a very capable man. He wanted to do it. He's very good at it. He is a good touch, a very good natural touch for the bonds and interest. And he did that. Then the reporter says, the yields have come back since then. Have you talked to him about another type of intervention? And Trump left everybody wondering whether he had been briefed about shocking military interventions and was just having one of his senior moments over the word intervention. And he said, because he said the military intervention was the answer to America's financial problems. So they're trying to nail him down. What do you mean, military intervention? And he says, we have many types of intervention. That's just one. The ultimate intervention is our military, and if we have to use that, we will. What does that mean? So according to Raw Story, just like it sounds, rawstory.com, the talking heads then went off, of course, with all these jokes about having the military bomb the bond market. The senior digital editor for MiddleEast.com hit a little bit closer to the mark with his attempt at gallows humor when he says, is the bond market 2 weeks away from a nuclear weapon? Of course, referring to Netanyahu's constant for over 20 years now. Iran was 2 weeks away from a nuclear weapon. But what the talking heads can't say out loud is indicated by giving Trump a pass on perhaps an even crazier comment that he made Friday. That the U.S. is in an excellent situation to keep borrowing from the world. In other words, because the strength of our economy, we're in an excellent position for the world to keep buying our bonds, which would keep the dollar somewhat stable. Well, the president just raised, with what just happened last week, and I'm sure you saw the indications, our debt has raced past 40 trillion in debt, with and the thing that took us over 40 trillion, of course, was a skyrocketing military budget. And so President Trump's answer to the fact that we now owe more than 40 trillion, he said, it's all based on credit, good credit, and we have the best credit, and we pay off the debt easy, very quickly. Well, so the talking heads can't say that this addiction that our federal government has, and our representatives and Senate as well, this addiction to this hyper-cancerous speculative bubble is what drives bankruptcy policy ever increasingly, trying to force these various countries into accepting the very abused U.S. dollar. Now, while Marjorie Taylor Greene recently called out Trump on the planning sessions for an imminent use of nuclear weapons, the plan to fire off nuclear warheads against Iran didn't just start last week, because Raw Story, and you can read this for yourself, ran a story by veteran White House reporter Brian Karem on how Trump's desperation over Iran has driven him to plans to nuke Iran. And so Karem in Raw Story wrote this: one unnamed Pentagon official confided to Raw America that the president's threat that a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again, which he posted to his Truth Social early last month, was seen as alarming everybody inside the Department of Defense. And what Trump said back in July, everyone should have known that this is on the table. Raw Story said, what do you think he meant by that? Well, the reality is that this country and the world is in an existential crisis with each of these options: senility or nuclear showdown. And it's made even worse by the likely presence of both. And there's simply no sitting this one out on the sidelines waiting for senility to push the button. Now, former U.S. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene called out the president for his latest vitriolic rant. She called him an old friend and comparing him to an internet troll. And she warned that he, quote, loses power and influence, he will turn more and more toward war. So on Truth Social last Friday, if you followed Truth Social, and 18 days after the three met, Trump went off on Tucker Carlson, something he referred to as lightweight former Congressman Thomas Massie, and Marjorie Taylor Greene. He said, losers all, in caps. First, Carlson, he said, has become totally irrelevant and happens to be surprisingly a very low IQ individual. If that wasn't juvenile enough, he wasn't finished. He said Marjorie Taylor Brown, he says Greene turns to brown under stress, a highly neurotic young woman, and Thomas Massie, a real jerk. Three losers. To all of them I say, praise be to Allah. Oh my goodness. This is just last Friday. Is he doing this, or is somebody else doing this? Is he really saying this about three people who once supported him, once voted for him, just like I did a year ago, believing that he would keep his election promises, of which he's turned against almost every single one of them? So the next day, Saturday, Marjorie Taylor Greene responded. She said this: he attacks us with such vitriol because we actually are everything he claimed to be, conservative and America first. And he has proven as president that he is nothing more than a neocon puppet for Israel, for corporations, for big donors with special interests, and his dear friends in the Epstein class. We never changed. Trump did. She goes on to say this: President Trump's demeanor, name-calling, absurd and reckless rhetoric is unbecoming of the office of the president. It's a bad example of leadership, and it's hurting America's reputation and place in the world. And at this point, he's no different than an internet troll or one of the many millions of bots that say horrible things. In the past, I supported him, she said, because of his policies he professed to support and passionately campaigned on. But now as president, he's been revealed to be a Trojan horse who enforces many of the policies he claimed to be against. I'm sorry I did not see this earlier and wish I had never supported him. Then she warned, quote, My biggest concern remains that as Donald Trump loses power and influence, he will turn more and more towards war and take actions to make himself feel more powerful and in control as he grasps and clings to the Oval Office. Hopefully, I am wrong. One little side note here I noticed in the news. The Bulgarian defense minister told reporters this weekend that only one U.S. air refueling tanker is at the Bezmer Air Base in south central Bulgaria, and that it left the country on August 21st. He says there are no aircraft here, meaning U.S. There are no U.S. aircraft here, and we have never had any other form of information about direct threats to our national security. I confirm that once again. Threats against their national security from whom? Well, from Iran. Because Iran has missiles that can reach Bulgaria. Now, Iran has taken out U.S. bases. I keep thinking 14, but maybe it's only 8. 8 to 14, something like that, U.S. bases in the Persian Gulf or the Middle East, including U.S. bases in Israel, U.S. bases in Qatar and Bahrain, in Saudi, the UEA, bases in Syria, bases in Iraq, to the point where they are unusable. And the one in Bahrain, which is the headquarters of the Fifth Fleet, is totally unusable. The port is unusable. And Iran has said, you try to rebuild these things, we will just come back with more missiles. Get out. So the parliamentary approval in Bulgaria for the American deployment to Bezmer covers 8 different aircraft. It runs through October 31st, but they're all gone. They've all been pulled out. So who can say that the U.S. planes won't return because parliamentary support says they can be there till October 31? Well, one person I like to listen to on Monday mornings is Alistair Crook. He's a part of the Napolitano crew. And an article by Alistair Crook on his Conflicts Forum Substack examined where Trump's latest total economic destruction strategy against Iran could lead the United States, where it could lead the United States. Crook, who's a former British diplomat and former MI6 intelligence agent, kind of usefully reminds readers how rapidly and inexorably Israel's war against Gaza and the Palestinians has become a war against Lebanon and Syria. And the the Israel-U.S. war against Iran, and now Trump's war of desperation, which has made the entirety of the Southwest Asian area tinderbox. And the war, according to Crook, the war could be leading Trump to use a nuke, something that Trump brought up with cabinet members Rex Tillerson in the State Department, General Mark Milley in Defense. And Crook says as long as a decade ago, Trump opted for pulling out of the JCPOA during his first presidential term, which we all know. And now with Undersecretary of Defense Elbridge Colby having taken the point for using nuclear weapons, he says this debate, assesses Crook, has not been finally settled. And he notes that Colby argues that failure in the military conventional area, referring to the conventional war against Iran, aerial bombing, could justify the use of tactical nuclear weapons to compensate for the loss of U.S. conventional deterrence. Because there's no Iron Dome left. Same thing in Ukraine. Ukraine has no ability to stop Russian missiles, Russian drones. And while Russia still possesses the ability, it shoots down most of what comes in. Some of it gets through, especially the ones aimed at oil refineries that are targeted not by Ukrainian targeting ability, but by the UK and the United States targeting ability, which makes us as complicit as the Brits. How long can this go on? Sammer, I like your comment there. Putin's patience is being tested and has been for a handful of years. Thank goodness Putin is as patient as he is. You know, they got an election coming up, and you know his popularity with his people? It's dropped. It's dropped from 80% to 70%. Can you imagine Trump having 70% popularity in this country? So in the course of the piece, Crook increasingly focused on the Treasury Secretary and who was supposed to execute this economic destruction strategy. And because of the position that Bessent has been taking, he's kind of eclipsed Hegseth anymore. When's the last time you heard about Hegseth? Because Bessent is now propping Trump up, and it's worth noting that the arrogant Bessent's latest great move, the escalation of the Treasury buybacks by the Treasury to keep dollar interest rates from rising, failed in less than a week, with those rates having regained and in some cases surpassed the alarm level of August 17th when Bessent said he had to do what he had to do. So what can Bessent do? Crook asks in his article. And he says that Bessent will be everywhere in his simultaneous attempts to get U.S. allies like Japan not to sell their treasury reserves is just going to produce the opposite effect. China has, if I remember correctly, it's not 2 billion, because 2 billion isn't that much. I think China has 2 trillion in U.S. debt. Japan something less than that. And so in Crook's piece, Trump mauls raising the stakes to force Iranian capitulation. I think it's worth reading. You can read this for yourself on his Conflicts Forum, one word, Conflicts Forum on Substack. It's definitely worth reading. And so now this dangerous situation where the potential has gotten us in this escalation in the regional crisis in Southwest Asia and Ukraine for that matter, that these can go out of control, I don't think has ever been as acute as it is now. And the immediate concern, because of what Marjorie Taylor Greene has said, and apparently some other people have come along with some evidence to indicate she wasn't just pulling this out of her hat, that the Oval Office is considering tactical nuclear weapons against Iran. And this tweet from Greene saying that she had reliable information that there was this discussion in the Pentagon and the U.S. administration, as I said, of using tactical nukes. She said this is not a guess. And she indicates that it came from a source which is a prime source, not like 2 or 3 steps removed. And to give this a backup if it's needed, there was a statement by Undersecretary, as I've talked about him before, Elbridge Colby, who stated it very, very clearly that they are reviewing what they call a rational nuclear option, a nuclear strategy review for the president to support the president with the option of using tactical nuclear weapons. This is open, this is out there. This isn't some conspiratorial talk. They're actually discussing this now. And then you have this president who flip-flops Not just every other day or anymore. He'll flip-flop in the same day, where he says we are going to take out an entire civilization. And then a few hours later, well, we're open to discussions, and the discussions are going our way, and the Iranians are going to buckle. When the Iranians say, we don't know what he's talking about. There aren't any discussions going on, and the Iranians don't need to discuss anything. They've already discussed it with missiles that took out all the American bases and has forced most of the U.S. fleet to run over to Diego Garcia, the British base off the coast of India, for refueling and refitting. How can you have won the conflict when that kind of stuff is going on? And what I'm talking about, the president, our president, Donald J. Trump, considering the use of tactical nukes, this is not something to be appointed or agreed upon by Congress. It doesn't even have to be made public. Unlike the Nuclear Posture Review, which does have such obligations, the so-called Nuclear Strategy Review is something which Congress just can't do anything about. Now, obviously, this has to do with the situation that by all accounts and all analysis, the United States has lost the war against Iran. And the situation, rather than walking away and basically folding up and saying this was a mistake and we should we should get out of there, Trump is vacillating by the hour, as I said, between saying he's talking to the Iranians and he's saying that there is no talk with the Iranians. Then basically the latest was to declare economic warfare on Iran with the most crushing sanctions in history against any country ever, he said. I mean, if the United States would have won this war, they would not have to go to economic sanctions, threatening not only Iran, but any secondary sanctions against any country which keeps having any kind of a relationship with Iran, which of course primarily targets the two biggies, Russia and China. And China has already said that they don't think that sanctions are an appropriate means to resolve this conflict, and for sure, they won't stick to it. Nor is it expected that Russia will. But this is upping the ante tremendously. So Trump says, to review here, he's going to initiate the worst sanctions that any country has ever had in its life, country-destroying sanctions, and any country that continues to do business with Iran. I just want you to see, I don't know if he's sitting at breakfast, at lunch, at dinner, on the golf course, in his cart, in church Sunday morning, whatever, sitting there furiously typing on his smartphone, on Truth Social, saying these things, the President of the United States. And Russia and China come back and say, what? We are not going to stop our relationship with Iran. So the Iranian foreign minister, Agrachi, basically dismissed the whole thing on the background, naturally, that Iran has been very successful so far in withstanding sanctions for the entire existence of the present Republic of Iran for 47 years. They have been under sanctions for 47 years. Billions of their money is still locked up in foreign banks because of these sanctions. Trade relationships have been locked up because of these sanctions. And Iran just won the war. But naturally, it's a situation which is currently in a very serious escalation. Agrachi said this is just an attempt by the United States to divert from its own massive economic and financial problems. And that happened on the same day when it was announced that the U.S. national debt just surpassed 40 trillion. So this is 3 trillion more in 1.5 years of Trump's second term. An absolute increase in the ratio, which can obviously not be maintained. And it is the speculation of many people, or the assumption, that what is behind this mad escalation is a desperation about the crumbling economy and the absolute bankrupt financial system that has the whole Western world in its grip. Now, the situation on the ground, naturally in the region, is absolutely out of control and in danger of horizontal escalation, meaning spreading out from some central point, the central point being Israel. Because not only do you have Israel conducting practically a Gazification of the West Bank by announcing new settlements all the time. And remember, the West Bank does not belong to Israel. Yeah, more than southern Lebanon belongs to Israel. Or parts of Syria that Israel is trying to take over belongs to Israel. But that doesn't stop them. And so they're announcing new settlements, driving the Palestinians out of the West Bank, out of their homes, of course being backed by the force of the IDF. And then along with that, the genocide in Gaza is continuing. You saw the comments of Ben Gvir. We want to kill about 30 to 40 Palestinians every day, just to keep them under control. Their Minister of Security says we want to kill 30 to 40. Because why? Because they're not human. There's something else. They're not human. Boy, that sounds like 1930s Germany. They're not human. It's kind of come full circle, hasn't it? And so, with the genocide continuing in Gaza, and now the tensions between Israel and Turkey over Syria are escalating as well, opening the potential for a new front on that line, because Israel has much more to fear from Turkey than they do Iran. Tehran's over 1,000 miles away. Turkey's just up the coast. And should this situation between Israel and Turkey over Syria escalate, the biggest army in that area is the Turkish army. And they're well trained. And if they were to drop down through Syria into Israel, they would have Israel under complete control within a week. The power of the Turkish Navy and the Turkish Army and the Turkish Air Force. And should Israel respond against Turkey, Turkey's in the UN or in NATO, and then there's Article 5 to deal with. Now, obviously, President Trump has been completely unable or unwilling to rein in Israel. So Israel's continuing whatever they're doing, and this naturally means it's a powder keg. You never know what Israel is going to pull or do next. And if Iran feels completely backed into the corner, they may just resume a new attack on Israel. And there are reports in the Financial Times that Iran has mooted that there is an escalation against Iran militarily, that they may attack U.S. bases in Europe, like the U.S. base in Bulgaria, or a British base in Cyprus, bringing the war even beyond the borders of the Middle East. And so Bulgaria said what? As I said earlier in the program, hey, there's no planes left here. There's no planes here. We're no threat to Iran. There are no U.S. airplanes No U.S. Air Force, no U.S. base left in Bulgaria. They're gone. Why would Bulgaria do that when they make an awful lot of money from a U.S. base located in their country or the other countries of Europe? The 28,000 servicemen that are in South Korea. South Korea doesn't want them there. But they are a tremendous economic support for the South Korean government. And there's other countries I could say the same thing about. But unfortunately, the major war that's going into Ukraine is clearly escalating because the British have started shipping massive Storm Shadow cruise missiles to the Ukraine, which are being used along with these drones that now have a far greater reaching destination point because they're being refitted by British engines. So that war is escalating to the point where the Russian ambassador in London said that the British government is going to retaliate the Russian government is going to retaliate in kind against the British involvement in all of this. And then they pulled the ambassador out of England, out of London. Russia did, as I said earlier in the program. About the last thing the Russian ambassador said, we're going to retaliate in kind against the Ukraine or against England. And that was even backed and made stronger by Foreign Minister Lavrov, who said that these actions are going to find an adequate response. He said that last week. These actions are going to find an adequate response. What's an adequate response to British cruise missiles hitting Russian refinery targets when those cruise missiles can't get there without the radar GPS positioning that the British and the U.S. have available to them, because the Ukrainians can't do it? So I would not be surprised if we have a real message coming from Russia to the European coalition of the willing countries, primarily Germany, France, and England, because they have published the 12 production places where these weapons are being produced and which are being used. Did you hear what I just said? The Russians have published the 12 production places where these weapons are being produced. They're not being produced in the Ukraine. They're being produced in England. And Russia published the location of these weapon production sites. So the war in the Ukraine is escalating massively. The access of Ukraine to the Black Sea is cut off completely, which naturally worsens the economic situation in Ukraine dramatically. Also, Russia has very clearly responded to the Ukrainian attacks on civilian targets in Russia by escalating the Russian attacks against principally Kyiv now. And there's large areas of the Ukraine that are without electrical power. They're without fuel. Gas stations left and right have been taken out by Russian drones. And we're headed towards winter. So we're sitting on a complete powder keg of the two wars, Ukraine and Southwest Asia, being merged together because of the Ukrainian attacks on Iranian tankers in the Caspian Sea. But naturally, the whole war is won in any case because the real reason has nothing to do with the regional historic specificities. It's the underlying geostrategic collapse of the old order and the effort by powers in the West not to allow the rise of a new system that's expressed by the countries of the global South who want to end 500 years of colonialism. So we're kind of in a unprecedented danger, and this is why I talk about this, although sometimes I wonder if this is doing any good. Honestly, I'm serious. I'm kind of wondering if the things that I talk about on K Talk are doing any good. I think I've lost a lot of my audience because I'm not rah Trump anymore. And I've lost a lot of my audience because I'm not talking about the good and wonderful things that life has to offer us. Instead, I'm talking about what may involve our country to a degree it has never been involved with since World War II, in the sense of sanctions on its own citizens, you and me, a collapsing economic system, collapsing infrastructure. And I would love to be spending my whole hour here talking about the spreading of the international peace movement. And there is an international peace movement that's gaining some ground. And they are trying to get Pope Leo XIV to be the spearhead. But there's many groups who are getting more and more, at least the people who are aware of the danger, they're getting really worried. And the discussions that I'm able to pick up in different countries using TV Garden, tvgarden.world. You can go to a lot of different countries and get English translations of their news, which I do. And it's not just me here at K Talk or other talk show hosts at K Talk or other talk show hosts or podcasters around the country who are talking about this. But interestingly enough, I saw this report from Germany over the weekend that a lot of the German people are aware of what's going on. They're aware of the fact that some of these missiles are being assembled in Germany. They're aware of the fact that Russia has the location of these assembly places. And they are starting to emigrate. They're getting really panicked. Russian families, German families who've been there for 1,000 years in some of the states and the cities of Germany are making plans to get out of Germany. And a lot of the people, they're desperately asking, what can we do? This is why the AfD, the alternate for Deutschland, the alternate party, which is kind of the right-wing party, is gaining ground and may actually end up with many members in parliament in the next election, because they don't want world war. They don't want the militarization of Germany to continue. Because if this comes to world war, the Germans know they will be annihilated, and maybe the first country annihilated, if someone were to send a nuke to Russia. And then, of course, nuclear winter will happen, and there's no place on the planet you can go to after that. I didn't mean to go on this long. I really didn't. It's just, once you start yapping, it's hard to slow down and shut up. So what can you do? Really, what can you do? Let's take care of your health and your family's health first. Should privation be upon us? Should there be food shortages? What are you prepared to handle that? Oh, well, we've got food storage. Well, what do you have in your food storage? More of what you've been eating? I doubt that it's organic. And I'm not here to promote food storage. I'm here to promote your individual health. If you saw what I took this morning in the way of supplements, you would not believe me. But it constitutes my morning breakfast. There's so much. Now, I have my health problems like everybody else. I have some situations that border on, should I say the word serious? But I'm still up and moving. I'm still seeing patients. I have a full morning this morning. I don't even know if I'll have the energy to get through it. Of people who don't want to be in pain anymore, who want out of pain. And there are people that I take care of that have been in pain for decades, and they just accepted that's their lot in life, to be in pain. And so they suffer through thinking that somehow it'll get better, and it never does. And then they start replacing joints, or they start getting shots, or they start moving towards a cane or a walker when that's absolutely not necessary. It doesn't cost anything to sit down and talk to me for a few minutes. If you don't want what I have to offer, we will still be friends. But you want to plan on sitting down for at least a half an hour. If you want me to take care of you, I will thereafter. If you don't, as I said, you can go your way and we will still be friends. But it has to be scheduled. 801-523-1890. We're too busy for walk-ins. 801-523-1890. And the girls will set you up with an appointment that works for us and works for you. Because the times that are coming, I believe, that are on the doorstep, you can't afford to be in pain when these days happen. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm really wrong. Maybe, everything's coming up roses and we're on our way to Tipperary, and the U.S. military, as President Trump says, will conquer all. But maybe that's not correct either. Well, that's going to do it for today's program. Those of you who are listening on the stream, thank you. And Samra, thank you for your comment. Is the U.S. pulling out of the Middle East? It sure looks like it. And why? Because Iran won the war.